One. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Be That 1% podcast. Welcome. If you are a return listener, welcome home. And if this is your first time to the show, welcome. We are diving deep into a topic that I care deeply about. And I had our guests, we have mutual friends, today's guest and myself, who has been on the podcast. His name's Lance Ecios. He was on a few episodes back, and Lance was like, you got to meet this guy. And so my guest today, Nick Motycka, him and I connected a few weeks ago. And after hearing his story, I was like, okay, we got to tell this story. We got to share this with my audience. And I want you to go as deep as you can in the time that we have in what your experience was, what you learned, and how you've come out the way that you have. And so we're going to go into deep. I'll explain what that means, but I want to give a little backstory on who Nick is. He grew up in Alberta with a father who was a member of the RCMP. Nick, what does that stand for?
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
There we go. And Nick has spent his whole life, basically most of his life, 23 years in various enforcement related positions: securities, loss prevention, bylaw services, Canadian Customs, court and prisoner services, as well as the RCMP. And something happened where that completely shifted. And that's a large part of what we're going to be talking about here today. And also what he's currently doing now, following his passion, living in an alignment with his lifestyle and what his values are. But there's something significant that changed the trajectory of his life. And that's where our story begins. And Nick, I just want to welcome you to the show, man. And it's been great connecting with you the last few weeks. And I'm excited to hear more of your story here live for myself and for our audience. So welcome to the show.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So we're talking law enforcement career, 23 plus years. Like, that's pretty set in stone. Your father laid that path. You seem to have followed in the footsteps at that point, and I think you even made reference to that when we spoke last. What shifted? What changed? Why give it all up, or why change to a whole different thing?
Yeah. So I guess the beginning of the end was very early 2020. So my wife and I had committed to making some lifestyle changes. So what that looked like for us was a diet change. So we did a 30-day gut reset starting January 1. And then we both started meditating daily at that point. And then about a year prior, cannabis actually had become legalized again in Canada, or not again, sorry, for the first time it became legalized. And I had kind of rediscovered cannabis. And so for me, those three factors, the gut reset, the meditation, and cannabis, set me on a trajectory that I could have never predicted prior to that. So first of all, what it looked like was about a month in, so around kind of the end of January 2020, I admitted for the first time that something wasn't right with me. And what that was my sleep. So at that point, I was working for the Calgary Police Service, and I was in a unit called the Gang Suppression Team. And so that was a shift work unit where we would work 4 12-hour night shifts in a row. And so what had happened over the course of years for me was my sleep had gone to shit, basically, for lack of a better term. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours in between my night shifts. And so by the end of those 4, I was no good. I was no good at work. I was no good at home. It would take me about 2 days after my set of 4 was over to even feel kind of human again. So at that point, so that early 2020 timeframe, that was it for me. I was done with feeling that way. And so I went to my family doctor and told him what was up for me. And that was the first time I ever admitted that that everything wasn't, just going well for me. And so that resulted in a doctor's note that restricted my hours to midnight. And in policing, as you can imagine, being a 24/7 shift work heavy occupation that is a little bit of career suicide, limits you in terms of different units and different positions you can be in. And so, but I was frustrated to the point where I was just at my wit's end. And so I put that note in and just kind of let go of controlling the outcome, and just, yeah, I guess let it up to the universe to see what happened next. And so what that looked like was, so my time in gang suppression was done at that point because I couldn't work past midnight. And so now we're into kind of that March, April timeframe. So of 2020, we all know exactly what was happening then in the world with lockdowns and all the craziness that was happening around that point or that time. And so the Calgary Police Service put me in a unit called the Public Affairs and Media Relations Unit. So this was now into May of 2020. And so this was the first time in my career where I was not working on the front lines. I was working actually from home at that point on a laptop in this media relations unit, where I was, myself and another sworn member were monitoring the Calgary Police Service's social media, so Facebook, Twitter, all the things, and answering people's questions and putting out releases, and that was kind of my job in within the police service. And I thought I had it made at that point. I was getting my sleep back regulated, not working shift work, working Tuesday to Friday, a set schedule, having weekends off consistently, and life was really good. And then at the end of June of 2020, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. And all of a sudden, my cushy online gig became one of the worst places to be. So that was into the defund the police movements and all of the negativity around policing that spilled over from the States and into Canada, absolutely. And it was just a really dark time, and the things people would say online, especially kind of the keyboard warrior mentality of just how people are, and saying things that they would never say to an officer's face, of course. And so that summer I pushed through that darkness, not really having any insight into it at the time, but I was definitely feeling it. And then fast forward into September of 2020, September 16th, I opened my laptop one morning and I saw that a bunch of messages had come in from a young lady who I'd been previously messaging with. Her mother was missing, and there was a police investigation, but they weren't really doing much for her. And her mother was kind of a marginalized. Addictions were an issue in and out of different shelters, and my police service that I was working for hadn't done anything for this lady. So I was trying to help her out. And so on this morning, September 16th, I received a bunch of messages from her through the Calgary Police Service Facebook page. And it was the first time anyone had seen the messages because they're not monitored overnight. And so the messages were a cry for help. She was suicidal. And for the first time in my career, I was unable to act. I kind of, my tunnel vision set in. I went into this catatonic state where I was just blankly staring at the screen, and there was parts of my brain that were still going, and I knew the things that I should be doing from the police standpoint, and that was, calling the appropriate people to have a call for service generated, to have a car go and do a check on welfare on this lady. And I knew that was what I needed to do, but I couldn't. I was just frozen in this weird state that I'd never experienced before. It's something in policing that is called actually code black, and it's not a desirable state, as you can imagine, to freeze under in a dynamic situation. Luckily for me, I was sitting at home on my chair on a laptop, so I wasn't out in public at that point. So I was frozen in this state for I don't even know how long, actually. And my wife came into the room and saw me and recognized, of course, that something was up, and she was able to kind of snap me out of it. And in that moment, I knew that something obviously wasn't right. This was new to me. I'd never experienced anything like this. And so I knew that I needed to call my supervisor, number one. So I got on the phone. I went up into our bedroom, and my supervisor, who is a civilian actually, she answered the phone, and I broke down and started crying for the first time as an adult. And I was trying to explain to her what was going on, which was, as you can imagine, quite difficult because I had no idea what was going on with me at that point.
Right.
So got off the phone with her. She gave me, of course, the day off, which I took. And I knew that my previous coping strategy of pushing down trauma. So throughout a career in policing up to this point, I was a 15-year member, and then worked in different enforcement jobs before that. My coping strategy was anytime I'd be reminded of a hard call or a hard situation that I'd been to or dealt with, I would just push it back down. It would come up, like be reminded through a smell, through a location, through any number of ways. I would remember it, and I would immediately know that, okay, this is not something that's comfortable for me, and I don't want to deal with this right now. So I'm just going to push it down. So
Was
that was
that
what,
when you say pushing down, is that the same thing as compartmentalizing to you, or are those different things?
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay.
It's pushing it into an area of my body where I don't have to deal with it. So
Right.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So that strategy, which had got me through 15 years of policing to this point, had run its course. It wasn't serving me any longer, and I knew that all of those hard calls had piled up or filled up, and I kind of pictured it like a cup. So in that moment, my cup filled up and overflowed, and that pushing it down strategy just wasn't cutting it anymore. And I knew that I needed to seek help to actually process these unresolved traumas that I'd never allowed myself to go there or to process in any way, shape, or form since they had happened. And some of them went back to early days in my RCMP career. So we're talking like almost 15 years old, where they're still there. There's still unprocessed emotions and everything with it. But I wasn't up until that point willing to do that. So I knew that that needed to change. And I vowed to myself that I wasn't going to go back to work until I had processed all of those hard calls and the unresolved trauma that lived in my body at that point.
Mm. There are a lot of people, I'm sure, listening, but in the world that go with the push down strategy. What do you think that is? Where does that come from? Is that a natural tendency that you think we all have? Is that a men's thing that we do? Is that because there's not a safe space to talk about it? So where else are we going to put it? What is your have you thought about that, and what's your thought on it?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a few of those factors that you mentioned. So for men, of course, traditionally not
Mhm.
supposed to show our feelings or show emotions or anything like that. And then, as you can imagine, in policing, it's a very masculine culture,
Mhm.
and to the point where even female officers become masculinized
Yeah.
within that profession, because that's the culture, right? Is to not show weakness, not show any of that vulnerability or any of those kind of traits. And then I think there is a natural tendency as humans too, and for me, when I didn't have those tools to deal with hard things, hard memories, traumas, all that, it was just, it seemed normal to just ignore it and push that down, because I, again, didn't have the tools or the
Yeah.
capacity or the bandwidth to deal with it at that point. So
Yeah.
I think a combination of those things.
And so when you found yourself in that catatonic state, what now that you're a few years removed from that, and we'll get to the part of your story where you've worked through that, what happened now that you've had time to breathe and reflect on it in that moment that someone listening could take proactive action towards to potentially save themselves from a situation like that?
Yeah. So for me personally, I needed that full in your face kind of breakdown. Of course, I don't look at it at all like a breakdown now. It was a breakthrough. I call it a breakthrough because that's exactly what it was. And quite honestly, it was probably the best thing that's ever happened to me outside of course, meeting my wife and marriage and kids and all of the stuff. But me personally in my own development, best thing that ever happened to me. So to avoid that, I think for a certain number of the population won't take those proactive steps before it's a full,
Right.
that rock bottom kind of situation. But if you recognize that you're going down that road, to take some proactive steps, and realize that this stuff isn't going away, right? Like trauma doesn't just over time disappear. It's just not how it works, right? You have to go back and actually process and deal with it in order to have it move through you, or else it just stays stuck in your body. So it would be great if people could recognize that, and it would have been great for me to have recognized that and to have done something proactive. But again, I needed that like slap in the face to wake me up to realize, okay, silly bugger, like this isn't working anymore. It's time to do something different.
Was there anything specific about that moment as far as like you didn't have control when you wanted it, or that was just the stacking of a unfortunate situation that someone was dealing with, that was is just one too many? Like, what factors in that situation have you pulled out that triggered that state?
Yeah. So with some reflection and the benefit of hindsight, of course, there's definitely a lot there. So it was a suicide related call that sent me kind of filled up my cup. And then when I look back at over my career, the majority of the unprocessed trauma that I'd experienced were suicide related calls. And then to go back even further, on my brother's 18th birthday, in a, alcohol fueled, just bad situation, he threatened suicide. And it was something I wasn't equipped for at all at that point. I'm about a year and a half older than him. So I was 19 and a bit year old young fella, and I wasn't equipped to deal with that. And then my family wasn't equipped to deal with it. And so they just like ignored it, like it never happened. And we just
Pushed it
moved
down.
on. Yeah, exactly. We moved on with life and have never spoken about that incident since. And so I think all of that initial, bad situation with my brother, and then having witnessed numerous suicides throughout my career, it was just something that I always had a really hard time dealing with, because I just, again, didn't have the tools to wrap my head around it or to process it.
Yeah. See, that's a really important distinction or like factor of all of this. I think anyone listening can relate to this in some way, where there's a part of your past where maybe you haven't taken the time to understand why there's such a strong reaction to a certain thing, right? Suicide in this case, but maybe it's abuse of some kind, or it's the way someone treats someone, and because there's not a lot of self-awareness around why that is or how it came to be, or things haven't been processed, that can stack over time and manifest itself in unproductive ways or unhealthy ways or just very dangerous ways that until looked at, sat with, worked through with the facilitation of someone who is skilled in doing so. Yeah, that's how we can avoid some of these situations, or at least the severity of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the willingness on our own part to
Yes.
want to go in and deal with it, because it's one of those things, right, where you can tell someone until you're blue in the face about what they need to do, but
Yeah.
until they've made that decision, it's just going right in one ear and out the other.
Yeah. And so from this moment, right, you have this, your boss gives you the day off, and then take us to the next part.
Yeah. So I felt the call to be in nature that day. So I drove, we were living in Calgary, or just south of Calgary, Alberta at that point, which is a short drive from the mountains. The Rocky Mountains start about, 45 minutes west of Calgary. So I drove out to the mountains and I sat on the banks of the Elbow River by some waterfalls, and I journaled about my kind of priorities in life and what was important to me and what I wanted my life to look like. And I just spent the day in nature, just reflecting. And then that's, of course, when I decided that I wasn't going to go back to work until I had dealt with all of my unresolved traumas. And I just set on an unknown path of healing, not knowing at all what that was going to look like. And so, as you can imagine, I had to, fill out lots of paperwork and whatnot, because it happened at work. My breakthrough happened while I was on duty. And so there was insurance companies I had to talk to, and WCB and psychologists and all sorts of things. And I was just, for the first time in my life, I was just like, okay, what I have been doing isn't working. So I'm going to go kind of the opposite and just be an open book and just totally vulnerable about this stuff. And so that's exactly what I did. And I was just telling people what my experience was up until that point, in the hopes that someone could help me. And so again, with the benefit of self-reflection and hindsight, I realized that the sleep was only a small portion of what the effects that these unresolved traumas were having on me. And so it was mood related. My patience was no good. So I was not the husband I knew I could be. I was not the father I knew I could be, the friend, the son, the uncle, all of the things. I wasn't good. And then I was at a point where I couldn't deal with any sort of like adversity in life. Like I would just shut down whenever anything would get kind of hard. And I couldn't watch anything with any sort of violence at all. So no TV, movies, anything with any sort of violence. I just couldn't handle it. I would just have to like walk out of the room. Same with music, any sort of aggressive music. It would just put me in this like anxious, bad state. And so all of those things had taken years to develop and become part of how I was showing up in the world. And it happened so slowly that I wasn't aware of it at the time. But again, looking back now, I see how that had all come to affect me in my day-to-day life.
And then, so I'm thinking about you as a father. So the first thing that was coming through my mind is going out to nature. I think nature is like the best psychologist. It forces you to be somewhat present. It forces you to reprioritize what's important, right? At least that's what it does for me. And that's what it does for a lot of people that I talk about. I'm not surprised that you brought out your pen and you started journaling nowhere else but nature. I think that's just a really helpful remedy for a lot of things. It's just get into nature more, get your feet on the ground, get near water, climb a mountain, like get around life, right? And away from the hustle and bustle of a city or, normal life that you operate in. So that was the first thing. The second thing was like how that was for you as a father. And I'm curious if your kids mentioned anything to you, or if this was just your meta-ness about how you thought you were acting towards your kids. Having two kids myself, I'm trying to place myself in your situation and figure out like how I would be if things are unorganized, or if they act up and they're supposed to do something, but they're not doing it. Like what could potentially happen in those situations? Anything there?
Yeah. My kids were pretty young at the time.
Okay.
So
Got
they
it.
didn't have, not that they've told me, they didn't have any, warning signs or were seeing anything in me. And so it wasn't that so much, but kids will show you wherever you're unhealed, right? And all the triggers and everything. And so it's it's definitely something that I've realized I was just ignoring up until that point. And I was just reacting and not with any sort of insight. And then I was just repeating generational stuff too, right? Like going back to the way I was raised and then the way my parents were raised. And it doesn't stop until one generation decides to, right? And so if we don't heal what has been passed on to us in the way, that we were raised, that maybe we wouldn't have chosen for ourselves if we had the choice. If we don't consciously stop that, then it's going to be up to your kids to heal that. And on the banks of that river that day in nature, after having my breakthrough, I knew that I didn't want to continue on and pass that on to my kids. And then just to take it one step further, policing for me was a job that I chose because it was known. Having a father that was in that life, it was all I ever knew. And so it was really ingrained in me the importance of having a pension and having benefits and having a stable income. And it was just natural for me to go down that road because that was the blueprint that was kind of laid out for me. But not maybe the best way to choose your career, because I mean, we're all so unique, right? And I realized quite quickly at the beginning of my policing career that while I thought that was going to be something that I would love and be just passionate about, that wasn't the case at all. When I got out of training and into the real world, I quickly found like, whoa, this is not at all what I thought it was going to be. And so I was living out of alignment for, my entire adult life, truly.
Yeah.
And so this moment, this breakthrough kind of brought in all of this stuff that I now had to kind of sort through and figure out. Yeah, big time. But exactly what I needed in order to make positive steps to move forward.
So I have on my notes here the two things that I wanted to touch on with what you just said. So I'm glad that you kind of took us there. The pressure that kids feel to maybe follow in the footsteps of their parents, right? And I think, I'm obviously a man, so I'm looking at it from that lens. Like, I didn't necessarily feel the pressure to have to do what my dad did in the same industry. But because my dad was an entrepreneur and had his own businesses, I was more likely to have that. And so I do. And I'm grateful that was. And I understand that there are people out there who may feel immense pressure to do the same thing that their parents are doing. How have you seen that, not just with your life, but with others' lives, right? That's like my first question. And then the second one is the voice inside of your head that I believe you mentioned the last time we spoke about, like, this really isn't inspiring to me, like being in this. For some reason, I'm just not feeling like this is where I truly belong, but I feel like I have to, so I'm just going to keep going. Talk about how like that compounds over time, ignoring that voice, and how that could possibly also had led to that catatonic moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've come to realize that I chose my career not only because of the patterning and the example that was set by my parents, but also my wife, who I call my oracle, because she is, pointed out to me here, it was probably coming up on 2 years ago, that I chose my career from my wounded inner child. And so what that meant, or what that means, is that I didn't feel seen or heard or felt like I was really like the priority as a child. And so in order to get that acceptance from my parents, I subconsciously thought, well, if I become a police officer and follow in my dad's footsteps, then they'll be proud of me, right? And then they'll see me. And then not only will they see me, but I'm wearing this uniform and this gun and all the things. And so I'll be seen and heard by the, general public as well. And so I think that had a big factor in my career choice as well, which isn't a good way to choose your career at all from your wounded inner child. But that was my reality. And again, very on a subconscious level, it certainly wasn't something I ever thought of. But as soon as my wife told me that, I just sat there and I was quiet, and she thought she offended me and like really upset me. And then, but it was just me, like it was a truth bomb, like it just hit me right in my heart. And it was like, yeah, that makes total sense to me. So, and don't get me wrong, there was parts of policing that definitely appealed to me, especially before I got into it and knew kind of the realities of it. And that was, I did, and I still do have a desire to help people. And so I thought that I would be able to go out there and truly be that person to in the people's moment of need, and be able to actually make an impact, which was pretty naive. Certainly those situations happen in a policing career, but not at all like you think it would, maybe, like as a naive young man or woman wanting to get into that profession. So wounded inner child, and then just following in someone else's footsteps that again, we're all so different that it just doesn't make sense that I would have been happy in the same career that my dad was in. And also my dad ended up being quite bitter and jaded by the end of his time in policing. So he didn't even like policing. And so I picked the career that he didn't like in order to get acceptance from him. Like it's all kind of messed up when you think about it, or subjectively.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that totally makes sense. And that's cool that you're able to see that now. And I'm sure that those are big revelation moment. And the voices in your head of like, when did that start? Was that initially like right when you started?
Yeah. So I thought that policing was going to be it, right? Like I'd worked in all these different jobs and I was gung ho, and like I thought this was going to be amazing. And I got to training. So with the RCMP, training is in Regina, Saskatchewan. It's called Depot. It's where all Mounties from across Canada go for their training. And got there and I thought, wow, this is going to be awesome. And then it wasn't. And I didn't love the training, but I was able to get through it and do quite well. And then I thought, okay, once I start working, then life is going to be good, and I'm going to be just happy as all heck. And then got out and started working in the real world. And so I got posted to a town called Sherwood Park, Alberta, which is a bigger center just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. So it's kind of a big metropolitan sort of area. And got out and immediately found that I wasn't happy at all, and it wasn't what I expected. And so for me, the things that stood out were just the level of deception. So every day you're just sorting through lies. So basically everyone lies to the police, right? And it's because it's a self-protection thing, right? So it makes total sense. But at the same time, that's the energy that you're dealing with every day, every call, every traffic stop, is sorting through what the truth is and what's kind of what people are just saying to protect themselves. And that's like the little old lady at the traffic stop who just blew a stop sign right in front of you. She'll lie, and like and then that really struck me as like, oh wow, yeah, no one is being honest with me, basically, and I'm left to sort through the lies. And then the energy of all of those calls are negative, as you can expect, right? Like whenever the police are called, it's not because people are having a good day.
Right.
And so that being in that sort of energy all the time, it just really, I didn't enjoy it. And it was progression over time where I really just felt like I was out of alignment. And it makes total sense now looking back that of course it felt bad, because I wasn't doing what I'm here to do, like my soul's purpose. And it felt heavy, and I didn't see a way out. I signed up to do this job, and I thought, no, I signed up, and then stubbornness, right, too, kicks in. And I thought, oh, I'll do my 25 years and then I'll retire, and then life will be good. And that was kind of my only option. And I didn't see any other alternative outside of that.
Yeah. And so you go through, I believe you said a year or so with therapy and seeing various, healers or therapists and psychologists, and none of that is sticking. None of it's really helping. They're not seeming to crack the code, and then something happens. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So those traditional therapies, I pursued them. I was all in. I was doing the eye movement stuff and exposure therapies and different traditional therapies that were being offered to me. And I just wasn't getting back to myself. And so in September of 2021, WCB put me in a program called the Return to Work program. And so it was 2 appointments with a psychologist a week and 2 appointments with an occupational therapist. And the program is called Return to Work. And so that was their goal, right? They were pushing me hard to get me back to work. And I was at a real low point at that time in my mental health. And I wasn't doing well. And again, those traditional therapies just weren't getting me back to myself. And so I had an intuitive knowing around that time that there was something in plants and in plant medicine and in nature that was going to be beneficial to me. And so I'd spent the majority of my career in policing in drug enforcement specifically, both with the RCMP and with Calgary Police. I spent a couple of years or 2.5 years with Calgary, actually in an undercover role in a drug unit, and had been around drug enforcement a good chunk of my career. And so, like any good drug cop would do, I just decided to grow my own mushrooms. So that's what I did. I ordered a kit off the internet, and I started growing these things. And I didn't know what I was going to do with them exactly. I had no grand plan, but I just had this inner knowing that that was going to be something for me. And so I was at a point where I was not getting the results I wanted from the professionals that were trying to help me. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll just grow these things and see what happens. So that's what I did. And so at that point, my spiritual journey had really accelerated as well, starting, of course, right back to that beginning timeframe in 2020. It had been accelerating throughout that intermediate time. And I grew the psilocybin on a sacred geometry clearing plate, and I was doing Reiki on the mushrooms regularly and just sending them good energy, basically, with the intention of not knowing exactly what I was going to do with them, but knowing that they were some part of my healing. So pushed through that program, that WCB Return to Work program, those 4 appointments a week that went from September till December. At the end of that program, I was at like my ultimate, felt worse than I ever had at any point. Those 2 ladies with that Return to Work program traumatized me more than I think anything that I actually experienced on the job in policing. And it was just like they were just pushing me to return to work, but without actually dealing with any of the root cause stuff. It was just trying to get me off of the books, basically, and back into my position with the Calgary Police Service. And I felt that every appointment, and it just put me in a really bad place. So at the end of that program, WCB gave me basically an ultimatum. They said, you have 48 hours to make a decision. Are you going back to work, or are you resigning? Like that was my choice I had. And so with my back up against the wall, so I'll go back to my oracle here. So my wife had told me a few months before that what I needed was a shaman who was also a psychologist. And so a few months go by, and I'd kind of forgotten what she told me. And then in that moment with my back up against the wall, I realized, you know what I need? I need a shaman that's a psychologist. And then I convinced myself that I came up with the idea, but of course she did. So in that moment, I Googled it, and I found one, and she happened to be in Calgary. And so I called her up right then and there, and I spoke to her on the phone, and she wasn't able to help me. She was busy teaching. And so she kind of put me off, and she referred me to a ketamine clinic. And at that point in my journey, I wasn't interested in any sort of a synthetic or chemical or pharmaceutical at all. And up until that point, I mean, traditional doctors had wanted to prescribe me all sorts of things, but I refused, just an inner knowing that that wasn't the right thing for me. And so I knew that in that moment that, plants were going to be it. And so I wasn't interested in the ketamine therapies at that point. I since have changed my perspective, and I'm a lot more open to that. But at that point, I was thinking just pure nature. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And then a weekend passed, and then she actually called me back the next week and was like, she'd been her own inner guidance had told her that she needed to help me. So she called me back and told me that she was gonna make it happen. And then found out later that I was actually her first client with psychedelics that wasn't a friend or a family member. And so that was her own resistance was kicking in there. So it's kind of interesting to see how that happens even with professionals.
Yeah.
And so we scheduled it for early January, or sorry, actually it was late January of 2022. And so it was a shamanic healing journey, psilocybin assisted therapy session. So my wife and I traveled to Calgary on January 28th, 2022, which was our 10-year wedding anniversary. No coincidence, of course. And then also just to kind of give you background of what was happening in the world, specifically in Canada at that time, the Freedom Convoy, so the trucker convoy, was on their way across Canada right at that moment. And so I was really feeling hope for the first time because I really disagreed and felt very strongly about how the government had really overreached and were breaching people's charter rights. So in Canada, it's called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they were breaching people's rights. And in policing, we dealt with a charter all the time. And when you breach someone's charter rights as a police officer, there's remedies. People have their charges withdrawn or their charges stayed, and there's remedies when people's rights are breached. And so the charter is super important. And what I saw throughout the pandemic was the complete, the government ignoring people's rights. So I was seeing this freedom movement happening and the support they were getting as the convoy was on their way to Ottawa. And it gave me hope for the first time in a long time. So it's our 10-year wedding anniversary. I'm feeling hope for the first time. And that's the day of my healing journey. So I'd, of course, grown these mushrooms and brought them with me. And there was a big ceremony involved. So there was drumming and calling in of protection. And she saged the whole place. And it was like this legitimate spiritual ceremony, which was something that I really was missing in my previous therapies. And something that I now know is so important in healing. And so I was all in. Like I just love that stuff, right?
Yeah.
At that point. So I held the medicine to my heart, and it is 100% a medicine. It's here for a purpose. Psilocybin I'm talking about, and that purpose is to help us, and it has potential to help so many people. So I held that medicine to my heart, and I'd written out my intentions in my journal. So I read my intentions 3 times forcefully with that medicine held to my heart, and then I consumed it. And my intentions were to process unresolved trauma that was causing me issues and causing me to not show up as the best version of myself.
Yeah.
So I took a little bit of time, and then I started feeling the effects of the medicine, and I, without any resistance, without thinking about it, I went into the bedroom of the place we were staying in, and I went actually right underneath the covers, and without any sort of work or like any sort of forcing at all, I just went back chronologically to that first hard call that I'd never wanted to go back to. And it was a suicide related call. No coincidence. Went back to very early in my career, and I went back to that place and I saw the situation from a new perspective. So psilocybin obviously alters your state of consciousness and allowed me to want to go back and relive this experience. And so I saw it from a different perspective. And that was, for me as a police officer at a situation like that, I had no personal ties to the person or people involved. So I had this realization that it actually wasn't even my trauma. I was just a witness to someone else's trauma, and me holding on to that and not letting it move through me was just not helpful at all. And so that was a big realization I had. And then the second part was that I had this, what I can only describe as radical Jesus level compassion for the people involved.
Yeah.
So in that particular case, compassion for this young lady who had she'd slit both of her wrists, along the artery, and blood was just pumping out of her arms with every beat of her heart. And so I just had this compassion for her and what her trauma story must have looked like to get her to that moment where I was called to try and help her. And so compassion for her, and also compassion for myself, in that I started in policing to try and help people. And so those factors, that perspective change of that it actually wasn't even my trauma, and then this compassion for the people involved and for myself, it processed. And I've had it pointed out to me since then that compassion is the highest frequency. And so it makes total sense that the highest vibration would allow trauma to process. And this wasn't anything I was consciously thinking of or anything of that sort at the time. It was just the magic of the medicine just led me exactly there. So I did that process for 15 years of policing. I went through and just did that same process with each of those hard calls that brought me right up to present time. And that took a few hours, I would say. I don't know exactly how long. And then it just kind of at that point felt complete. And I came out of the room, and the psychologist was coming in regularly and checking on me. And I didn't know what the therapy session was going to look like, of course. I thought that there'd be a lot of like her coaching me through things and talking me through things, but that wasn't, for me, that wasn't the case at all. I had a really strong intention, of course, that I'd written out and then stated before I'd taken the medicine. And also I was just very willing to want to go in and like actually deal with this stuff. And so that's all I needed. And the medicine just let me do all of that. And so she would come in and check on me. Do you need anything? Like, are you doing good? And I was good. And then, so my wife and the psychologist shaman were in the other room when they weren't, when she wasn't coming in and checking on me, and they were getting along really well. And I could hear them giggling, and I'll never forget, like, so I'm under the covers dealing with like my like darkest stuff, and I can hear them giggling in the other room, and it would bring a smile to my face every time. And it was perfect. Like
a pattern interrupt.
Yeah, it was everything about that day was perfect. And it makes total sense. And there's no coincidence, right? When you're in that place of like that openness and with that clear intention, like it just makes total sense that it did exactly what I had asked it to do.
So I want to pause there for a second, because compassion, I think, is so critical. And for a long time, I thought empathy and compassion were the same thing, and they're not. Empathy is a part of compassion, but compassion is different from empathy. This is from like the academic research and the studies that they've done around this. Empathy is being able to understand someone's situation, to attempt to be in their shoes in a way, right? Whereas compassion is that too, but the second component is the willingness or the motivation to help, to support, to encourage, to potentially challenge. It's the action piece to the empathy. That's what compassion is. And so that's what I've learned in the last year and a half. And so writing a book that I'm writing right now about leadership and 5 C's, and one of those is compassion. So that was like the first thing that I thought about, and it's no coincidence that you felt that while in the medicine. The second thing is in the Eastern texts, like the Eastern world, Eastern philosophies, enlightenment can only happen through compassion. And so, that being, if not the highest, one of the highest modes that we can operate in as human beings, learning how to cultivate that from the inside will only emanate outwards. And every interaction you have, that now has the potential to come through. And through that compassion, healing could happen. People's genius can emerge. They feel a deep connection that maybe they haven't felt in their entire life. And you become healer might be a strong word, but I choose to look at it like that. You become a healer through just your presence because of the inner work that you've done. And do you need to take psilocybin to get there? No. There are other modalities to do that, but it can, in your case, and through my experience, it can expedite or provide opportunities that open your mind to new ways. And so hearing your story is cool, and I love it, and I'm glad that you had that experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In your description of compassion, it's an amazing thing when you can get there. And I'll just tell you a quick story about like how deep that compassion went during this healing journey. So one of my hard calls that one of my traumas was my involvement in it was a homicide investigation in Calgary. And so it was grandma and grandpa and their 5-year-old grandson were murdered by an individual who, there was like a bad business thing that he'd had with the grandparents, and he came to the house to kill the grandparents, and the grandson happened to be there. And so he killed him as well, a 5-year-old. And so that was really hard for me. I spent a lot of hours in the scene of that homicide as part of a search team. And like the little guy's shoes were still at the back door. Like it was fucking tragic. And at that point I was a new dad. And so that was like all new too, to be dealing with children, now being a father myself. And so in my healing journey, I had that same sense of compassion for the murderer, and what his trauma story must have looked like to get him to that place where he did those unspeakable things to other humans. I still felt that compassion for him, and not like, yeah, I'm not like giving him a pass or anything like that, but I just had this like deep understanding of like, hurt people, and that's it, right? And unresolved trauma is at the root of what he did that day, and is at the root of so many of the terrible things that we see in today's world. Is people walking around with this unresolved trauma and having no awareness of it, and just continuing that cycle of it. So anyways, that's how deep that compassion went.
I mean, hurt people do hurt people, and I think it takes a very mature, aware individual to entertain someone's backstory when that person has done something significantly, let's call it bad, negative, right? Like a murder or a situation that should never have been done. For someone to look through and say, how did that get here? As opposed to just looking at the incident and trapping that individual into that label, right? And that hatred towards the person for the thing that was done is warranted. It could be justified, but deeper is that compassion piece. And if that compassion can be acted on many different levels throughout one's life toward other people, we can minimize those types of individuals who do those extreme things. And everyone has a story, and we're all human, and we all have these influences that we can control and not control. And if we learn to think like that, then we're going to be a lot more understanding, and we don't have to outcast as often or exile parts of ourselves and others. Because truly, when we hate things externally, it's because we hate things internally, right? And so it isn't until you do the inner work that you see holistically who a human being is and what a human being is capable of. And it's in that where true choice really can emerge. And when you see both the dark and the light of a human, and then say, I'm going to choose X, Y, and Z, there's a full autonomy there, but also like there's just a full spectrum understanding there too. And I think your communication skills dramatically increase. Your ability to house and hold information to support people increases. And we as a collective can become more healed. And when we're more healed, we do better things.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the system that we currently have, where we just lock these people up and it's almost like eye for an eye and vengeance and that sort of thing. Like, that's not healing, right? That's not going to get us to the place we need to be. And I don't have an answer for what our systems need to evolve into, but what we're currently doing isn't going to get us to where we need to be. And I truly do feel the collective consciousness rising, and I'm hopeful for the future that as that continues to happen, that we'll come up with ways to actually heal and to move forward. I mean, bad things are still going to happen, of course, but to find a way to move forward in a positive way, and everyone is going to be better off for it.
Yeah. The quote, "What you resist persists," right, comes to mind when we're talking
Absolutely.
about this,
No,
right?
absolutely. And that goes for trauma too, right? Like, I resisted my trauma for my entire career, and it just kept showing up and then over time gradually, changed me into something lower vibrational.
Human condition is just, it's wild and beautiful all at the same time.
Yeah, it
And
really is.
yeah, yeah. So so you had this experience. Have you had one since?
So with psilocybin,
Yes.
I have. Yes, I've had one since, and very different experience, very
Usually.
healing
Yeah.
and very insightful, but very different. But it makes total sense because you get exactly out of it what you need at that time and in the position you're in. And so, yes, I have, but not in that same way.
Got it. Got it. And so since then, and removing yourself from the police force and that kind of industry, now emerging into owning your own business and doing more of a passion project and something that serves you and your community and even the world, and how you're redefining or maybe reinventing or going your own way with the clothing that you're creating. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to back up just a little bit before I get into that.
Yeah.
So before my healing journey, my psychologist, who's actually a PhD psychologist and also a shaman, so she did all the standardized testing on me and whatnot. And so I was diagnosed PTSD and on the severe side. That was before my healing journey. So healing journey happens. And then about 6 weeks later, WCB, they had no idea what I was doing, right? Like, I did this completely on my own.
Yeah.
I had to pay for it myself and make it happen for myself. So they ordered a comprehensive psych assessment that happened again 6 weeks later. So it was a half day interviews and all the testing again. So that psychologist called me back a week later and told me that I didn't even meet the criteria for a diagnosis. So it's abundantly clear to me that this medicine, with the right intention in the right circumstances, with the right mindset, has the potential to help so many people process trauma. Because what it did for me was it allowed me to go back to those dark places where in my, normal consciousness, I would just had these blocks and everything was compartmentalized, like you mentioned earlier, and like locked away tight in different corners of my body. And I couldn't access those in my normal waking state. Tried through all the traditional therapies. And I mean, I could tell, like I told that story about, the lady who cut both of her wrists, and about that homicide I just told you about. And like, I could tell the story, but I wasn't going back and processing things. It was just like I was just regurgitating a memory almost. And so the psilocybin allowed me to go in and just work through it and experience it and move it through my body.
Yeah.
So that was profound, and it has so much potential to help so many people, even outside of first responders. We all have varying levels of trauma from childhood, from all the things that happen to us in our day-to-day lives. And this medicine has, just amazing potential to get through those barriers that we put up internally. So as this whole
on that real quick,
Yes.
have you heard of IFS, internal family systems?
No, I've not.
It's a form of therapy where it's the creator of it is Richard Schwartz, PhD. He started studying individuals who were, suffering from bulimia and these extreme conditions. And over the course of working with so many of them, he began to notice that in their description of when they would do the task they didn't want to do, like the cutting or the vomiting or whatever, that they would say something in me is telling me to do it. Like there was another entity, another part of them that was different than who they normally are. And he just kept seeing this time and time again and was like, what is going on? Like, who is this other person? And one session, he just decided to ask the patient to talk to that part. Like, I want to talk to whoever that is. And so the individual snapped into that part to communicate with the therapist. And then they had a dialogue. And Richard, the creator of this, was basically asking, like, what do you want? Why are you here? And it wasn't in a judgmental way. It was in like an invitational, like, clearly there's a message you're wanting to get through. What is that? And through the course of this, like, created this whole internal family system kind of framework where we have parts of ourselves in ourselves that can get exiled or pushed out or not entertained. And it isn't until we integrate and have a holistic kind of harmony between all the parts in us that we can have, a better quality of life. Right. And so when you were talking about visiting these moments, that's what popped up for me. And it was like just being present with what happened. Right. And a lot of what Richard talks about is being present with these parts that you haven't created space for. And when you do, when you begin to communicate like that, insights start coming through, things get processed, you feel lighter, energy starts moving, and you feel a sense of completeness, which is what you were talking about. And whether that's going through a psilocybin journey, going through a meditative experience, a breath work session, ayahuasca, or just being in nature, like, there are many different ways to go. I think at the end of the day, it comes down with being present with what was and understanding it. And through the being present with it, things kind of work out for, what works best for you. Does that align with what you were talking about?
Yeah, I think exactly. And it comes back to another thing you said earlier, and that was what you resist persists. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you start to shine a light into those dark corners of, those voices and that motivation and the different things, once the lights shine there and you're willing to go there and actually look at things, it's now all of a sudden insights and whatnot will come to you, and you'll
Yeah.
be able to move past it, because you're
Yeah.
not pushing it down anymore. You're willingly going there. And that for me was a big revelation I had through my journey, was that I was putting so much energy on just pushing stuff down, that once I willingly went in and processed that stuff, I was able to liberate a ton of energy that I was focusing inward to hold things in place. When now I can move that through me, and now that energy I can put into more positive places.
Beautiful. And one of those places is what you're about to talk about next.
Yes, absolutely. So going back to the very beginning of our story, so January 2020, with the meditation, during one of my meditations early in that time frame, the idea for what became my brand, Flow State Designs, came to me. And so at that time, I was looking for a locally made, natural fiber, just good fitting, quality, basic t-shirt, and I couldn't find it. I could find some brands that would check one of those boxes, but they would be, polyester and made in Vietnam, or I could find one that maybe would check a different box, but then the other two wouldn't be addressed. And so in this meditation, I had the idea of like, oh, I can't find this. There must be other people that are also looking for a similar product. And so I decided at that point that I was just going to make it myself, and no previous experience or anything like that in this world. I just started taking one step and just then taking the next one when that came up. And I was at a point in my career where I obviously wasn't happy, and doing something that felt good in my heart, which was my brand, just was the opposite of what I'd done in my life up until that point, and that just felt good. So that's what I did. So during my whole trauma, healing journey that I just talked about, Flow State Designs was slowly building in the background. And so when that doctor told me that I didn't meet the criteria for a diagnosis anymore, of course, my WCB benefits stopped in that moment. And the Calgary Police Service were expecting me to come back to work. And so I was feeling really good. And life I was feeling quite content in my life at that point. And going back into policing felt terrible to me. The idea of that and being back in those, negative encounters and in that energy just wasn't in alignment for me anymore. And I was feeling good, but I felt like if I went back into that world, I would just end up re-traumatizing myself and be right back in the same situation. So that, and then also I'd since witnessed the really darkness of what became of the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, with the Canadian government enacted the Emergencies Act to deal with peaceful protesters in the nation's capital, and went in with riot police and just stomped on these people who were peacefully protesting mandates that the government had put in place. And they didn't even give the people a chance to talk about what their grievances were. Like, there was no dialogue, there was no interest on the government's part to talk to these people. So anyways, my own integrity, I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to enforce unjust mandates. I'm not going to trample on people's charter rights because the government thinks that's what I should do. That's not how it's supposed to work. And so those two factors, I made the only decision that was possible for me, and that was to resign from policing. So I put in my resignation, and then had some leave and whatnot that had to happen administratively. And so my last day as a police officer was April 20th of 2022, which is 420. So I see you, universe, like, well played. And so I haven't looked back since. Now I'm going all in on my apparel brand. And also, even primary to that actually is what we're doing right now, and that's spreading my message. This is my mission, is to just potentially help people with my own story of healing, and just show people that there's possibilities outside of traditional therapies, and there's the possibility exists to truly process these traumas and this dark stuff that lives within us, and to move forward in a positive way. And there's post-traumatic growth on the other side of it, and that's something I've experienced in a big way in my own life. So that brings us to today, basically.
Yeah. And what's it been like creating from the ground up your company and those that you share it with? What's the feedback that you've been getting?
Yeah, it's been awesome. Just being in alignment, and for me, producing a product that it's the best possible product I can make at this point. It's the best possible fabric, and it's the highest quality and the best possible fit, and all those things. Like, that's the energy I put into it. And so it's just completely in alignment for me. And like, even down to, and for me, I never would have been satisfied with, buying a blank already made shirt. It wouldn't have been the right fabric. It wouldn't have been the right fit. I'm like an attention to detail guy. So like, it took me a long time to come up with have it fit right. I knew in my head what it was going to look like and feel like, but it took a long time to get that into physical form. And I needed to be able to have that control over it. And so even to the level of, on the inside of the care and content label of our shirts, I've had a piece of clear quartz crystal, a tiny little piece of clear quartz crystal sewn into the label. And I've sent that positive energies of grace and abundance and gratitude and compassion and flow and a bunch of positive energies, and then had that sewn in. So it's on your body every time you wear one of our products. And it's just intentional clothing. It's everything about it is conscious in terms of like, it's locally made, it's sewn in Calgary, Alberta by people making a living wage. using the best possible fabrics that are better for not only the people wearing them, but for the planet as well. Hemp is an amazing fiber. Hemp-based clothing is amazing. It has so many positive benefits for, again, both the people wearing it and for the planet. And so it just feels really good to be in alignment and just showing up and being vulnerable and telling my story on stages like this. And again, in the hopes that people can take something from it and implement that in their own lives and their own healing journeys.
And I see you have them in the background. So you have how many colors now?
There's 4. Yeah. 4 different colors, and then short and long sleeve. And I'm working on other new products all the time. So a woman's specific tee, and I have plans for a whole line eventually, but starting with the men's t-shirt.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm so happy for you that you found what lights your soul on fire, what helps you become a better husband, father, leader. The fact that you're being proactive with finding the resources to make something that's locally made, I think is really big and important, and something that we're missing in our economic Western world, right? Where everything is like, how can I build it for the cheapest, not necessarily for the most quality or what's best for the environment. So thank you for leading the front on that. And as we wrap up here, is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with as far as insights? I know you're going to provide a link for them to go and check out some of your clothing. So maybe you could talk about that, and then maybe where's the best place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I would say just trauma, again, is something that isn't going to go away without intention and some sort of work. And it's not going to be psilocybin for everyone. I totally get that. And I've since experienced some really intense breath work, and that's been super profound and actually as intense as some of my big psychedelic experiences. Sure. And just to put in perspective, like my healing journey was a little over 6 grams of mushrooms, and with just my breath, I'm able to go into places and heal things that's it's wild. So there's different modalities for everyone, and I would just say, like, there is hope on the other side. And I've seen and heard stories from people that just have unbelievable trauma stories, just awful things that happen to them, and those end up being your gifts, the stuff that you can work through and push past and grow on the other side. Is you are more powerful for it on the other side. So it's so worth it. It's not easy, of course, but again, so worth it. And then as far as the clothing goes, I want to share a link with a sizable discount on it. And I want to get this clothing out and onto people, because it has its own healing properties with the crystal in it and with the energy that I've put into the clothing and the way it's been designed and made and all of that. And so I just want to get that out and on people as far and wide as possible, and then end my story as well as far and wide as possible. So I just appreciate very much the time and the platform to be able to share my story. And this has been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Instagram would be best way, website?
Yes. Yep. So Instagram is probably the primary one, but I'm pretty active on TikTok as well.
Hey, okay.
I'm trying to break out of this old guy mentality. So and we can put all those links in in the notes. But and if anyone wants to reach out, trauma specific or chat or whatever, I'm very open to hearing from people as well. So we can put my contact details in there. That would be awesome.
Yeah. Beautiful. Nick, I appreciate you, brother. I hope you have a great day, and thank you for your heart, man.
Thank you. And I appreciate you for yours and what you're doing and putting out into the collective. It's amazing. So thank you.